Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to talk about how much the British government bought the land we know today as Kenya, or how much the government paid for that. Of course, there was no Kenya before the arrival of the colonial power. Of course, the land was here, and sometimes I think we get lost into the map or the boundaries that were created by the British, such that sometimes people make arguments that it sounds like they are trying to argue that Kenya did not exist, the land. And when I say Kenya, I mean the land. The land, of course, has been here forever. But of course, the region or the country known as Kenya is a very recent creation. It's a country that was created, we can say, maybe 100 years now. So it's not a very old country. Now, when the British arrived, the process through which the British acquired Kenya is very interesting. This video, or the idea of this video, comes from a book I'm reading at this moment. And it's a book titled The East Africa Protectorate. And this is a book that was written by one Charles Norton Elliot. Now, Charles Norton Elliot was appointed to be the commissioner of the British East Africa. That was in 1902. And he served in that position up until 1904, when he was forced to resign under some allegations of money being paid to some groups, I think something of that kind. He does mention that in the book, but he doesn't go into the details of what actually happened. But he acknowledges that he was forced to resign in 1904. Now, by that time, or when Sir Charles Elliot was appointed to be the commissioner of British East Africa, it was called the East Africa Protectorate. That was the name that was used for it. And there was the Ugandan Protectorate. So East Africa was just the land we know today as Kenya, at least more or less the same land, because there were changes that were made. The map changed a little bit. Now, Sir Charles Elliot wrote this book the book was published in 1905. So that's like a year after he had resigned. And it's a very interesting book, and I'm still reading it. And he starts talking about the history of East Africa way before the arrival of the British. He talks about the East African coast. We can call them Commonwealths, the sultanates in Zanzibar and Mombasa, all the way to Mogadishu. He also talks about the time when the Portuguese were around and what the Portuguese did. So it's a very interesting book. Now, one part that I found to be the most interesting for me is how it describes the coming up or the emergence of what now became the East Africa Protectorate, which later on became Kenya. And it's, of course, is the same story for most African nations today. He talks about the British and the Germans coming into the land. Initially, they had contacts with the Arabs at the coast and the Swahilis. But then they were interested into the land. And he does describe why the British was so much interested in the land we know today as Kenya. He talks of it as being perfect for the settlement of the Europeans. The climate was perfect. The land was really good for farming and keeping animals. And he compares it with the land in Uganda. And he says, while Uganda is, of course, it's rainy and all that, he says that Uganda, unfortunately, the climate was not as good as the climate that was here. And he also talks about the Ugandan part being a lot more densely populated by what he calls the natives. But the East Africa Protectorate had more land that was, you can say to some extent, empty. Now, the way they acquired this land is very interesting. In the British, and he describes what the British and the Germans were doing, specifically the British and the Germans, and he talks about these people talking to what he calls chiefs, and these were like identified leaders of African communities. Now, the people who were doing those negotiations were not actually government officials from Britain. They were not. That's a fact that is often lost, even though history does acknowledge that it was not actually the government. These were private citizens for the most part, and more specifically, they represented private interests. They represented a company. And we know it as the Imperial British East Africa Company, IBEA. That's the company that, that's for the British. And the same thing, or the same kind of entity, or the same entity, or A similar entity was working on behalf of the Germans, and that's the entity that acquired the land we know today as Tanzania or Tanganyika. And they did go to Uganda, the Germans, that company, and they had some agreements with the African leaders in Uganda, but at some point there was a treaty between the British and the Germans, and the British took Uganda and Kenya, and the Germans, of course, took Tanganyika. Now, how they did it was talking to these so-called chiefs, and these so-called chiefs were we cannot even say that these people had the right to negotiate on behalf of anyone in terms of giving out the land. It gives one example that I found to be like it shows you how much corruption was going on when it came to the British acquiring the land. He talks about there is a settlement that used to be called Witu near Lamu, and this settlement was a settlement of outlaws, basically. These were criminals who had escaped from, we can say, Lamu, Mombasa. They ran into that settlement, and that's where they stayed. And the Germans go there and they negotiate with so-called leader of theirs, and he gives them the right to own the land around that place, that he signs some document and that I've given you this land. So that's what they used to do. They used to go to these so-called leaders, chiefs, and I think most of them were not even chiefs. They were just spokespersons, and some of them maybe they picked random people and they made them sign documents, and then they gave them the title of chief. And then, of course, there was nobody here to counter-check if they picked anybody randomly and they told them to put Kidole here, and then they go with the papers to the UK and say, we've gotten rights on the land. So that's what happened. So the Imperial British East Africa Company, IBEA, is the one that acquired the rights on this land. And another thing I need to point out is that they were signing these documents with people from different regions. So it's very hard to even say when a chief of one particular community signed a document, what was that exactly in terms of how much land they were giving up. That was, I think it was a lot of chaos, but they knew what they were doing. Now, after the Imperial British East Africa had acquired basically the rights to the entire of the land we know today as Kenya, you can say more or less that land, because as I've said, there were changes that happened later on. After 1920s, there were changes that were being done on the map. Now, they started managing the land, but the land was so huge for them to do anything. So they just took the land. They were trying to figure out what to do with it, and they were trying to negotiate with the British government to help them construct the railway line. But then in 1895, they held conversations or discussions with the British government, and they decided to sell the shares of the company to the Crown. And this company was paid £250,000. And after paying that, this is what Eliot writes about that. He says, in 1895, the company sold their rights to the government for £250,000, and the East Africa Protectorate was constituted. So after the Imperial British East Africa Company sold the rights, as he calls them, which we can say maybe it's the shares or something like that, they sell this to the British government in 1895. And that's where now the protectorate is established. Now that is officially a colony. So yeah, so that's how much the British government paid for the land. I don't think the Imperial British East Africa Company paid anything to anybody among the so-called natives. I don't think that happened, because I've not come across a document that says that. There were all these signing of documents. Maybe they bought them gifts, stupid, cheap gifts, and they persuaded them to sign these documents. Those are my random thoughts.